The submarine that broke the Cold War. You think the Cold War was won by missile silos and treaties. But wait, here's the twist. The balance under the ocean turned on one insider with debts and a photocopier. The warning lights were green, but the water felt wrong. Tracks that used to crawl across our maps just stopped. Commanders blamed weather and computers, anything but betrayal. The shield that made Soviet submarines visible, America's underwater ears, got turned against us. One man walked keys, routes, and thresholds out in grocery bags, and the Atlantic went quiet. The Pentagon's confidence cracked. See the paper trail and you'll ask, how long were we blind and who paid? Did a US insider sell the keys that let Soviet submarines slip past the net we trusted most? That's the question that kept people up. Watchstanders, skippers, and one handler who knew exactly what to ask for. This isn't a missile story. It's a silent story. Because our advantage wasn't just steel and reactors. It was patterns in noise. The hums and tonals turned into bearings and warnings by a hidden cadre of listeners. Here's where things get interesting. If someone handed over crypto keys, thresholds, and our habits, then discipline, not new steel, could blind us in real time. Now meet the fracture point. A Navy communications specialist drowning in bills, telling himself those first copies were harmless. A code list here, a call sign there. He could rationalize it. No names, no blood. Debt, ego, and boredom did the rest. Meanwhile, somewhere in a cramped safe house, a Soviet officer circled dates on a calendar and said, "Bring us what helps us here less." Not more, less. Because if they knew our thresholds and habits, they could skate along the edge and never trip the alarm. What nobody realized for a while, our invisible wall already had hairline cracks. Detections dipped. Analysts blamed the ocean. Memos flagged possible compromise and disappeared into drawers. The damage wouldn't announce itself with a bang. It would arrive as absences. Blank LOFARgrams, missed windows, crews sent farther forward to guess where certainty once lived. Here's what we're going to do. We'll trace the betrayal from the first stolen page to the last sleepless night it caused. You'll sit with the watchstanders who learn the voices of propellers and the officers who signed the budgets that made the ears bigger. You'll stand over a kitchen table where a relative weighed fear against family and picked up the phone. And you'll feel the moment a commander looked at a clean lane that should have been dirty and realized the ocean had changed, or we had. 3 reveals. First, the shield wasn't a wall, it was a bet on silence and patterns. Second, a mole turned that silence into a map the Soviets could read. Crypto keys like KL-47 and KW-7 lists, fleet broadcast rhythms, and SOSUS processing thresholds that let disciplined skippers ghost our arrays. Third, the loss forced a quiet redesign of America's undersea strategy. More layers, more doubt, fewer assumptions. Roadmap. Pillar I, the invisible wall, how SOSUS made oceans predictable until a sub reappeared where it shouldn't. Pillar II, the rotten core, inside the life of the spy, the tradecraft, and the near misses from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s. Pillar III, fallout, panic assessments, quiet fixes, and the chilling audit of what slipped by. While the Atlantic hummed with confidence, a photocopier light blinked in a back office, and the ocean went dark. Building the invisible wall. To understand how the ocean could go quiet, you have to see how we taught it to speak. After the war, both sides raced to master what really decided who survived undersea: noise. Submarines weren't just steel tubes. They were orchestras of pumps, reduction gears, propellers, and coolant loops, each playing a pattern. If you could hear the pattern far enough away, you didn't need to chase. You could wait. The Navy's answer began with a simple, brutal insight about water. Low sounds travel. Engineers and oceanographers mapped a highway of pressure and temperature, the deep sound channel, where certain frequencies slid for hundreds of miles with barely a whisper of loss. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Put long lines of hydrophones where that channel lay, wire them back to shore, and let trained ears pull out order from the noise. Secret name, SOSUS. Public story, ocean research. The shore stations were bland, NAVFACs, where sailors in no-rank coveralls watched paper scrolls crawl with ink. On those scrolls, a submarine wasn't a silhouette. It was a ladder of narrowband tonals, those precise singing lines that came off shafts and turbines at fixed ratios. Watchstanders learned those ladders like radio DJs know voices. A certain beat in the prop, that's an early November class. A wobble at the third harmonic, blade nick. A steady, high-frequency hiss, that pump's bearing is going. The best could tell class, sometimes even hull, with a glance. The work was monotonous until it was. Compartmentalization kept the wall strong. An operator at Centerville Beach saw bearings and gram writers. A maintainer at Eleuthera saw cables and amplifiers. Analysts at the fleet centers fused bearings from Iceland, Wales, Barbados, and beyond into positions and movement histories. Very few had the full map. Fewer still knew the precise sensitivity thresholds of the arrays, the decibel levels and frequency bands that meant the difference between a ghost and a fix. That secrecy was armor, but it was also a blindfold. If you don't know what your system can't do, you also don't know how it can be beaten. As the arrays matured, confidence grew. The GIUK gap became a toll booth. Soviet boats fed into predictable lanes, patrol craft blown south by weather into currents, missile subs staging into bastions, attack boats doing screen duty. We learned their habits. Transit windows tightened until you could put a coffee cup down on the plotting board and call the time they'd cross a bearing line. The ocean started to feel like a city with bus routes. Behind the glass, the human element carried the load. Junior sailors learned the ritual: fresh paper, clean stylus, ink flowing just right. They joked about whales, the Jezebel monster that turned out to be a blue whale's song. But their shorthand for the Soviets was dry and hard: contacts, bearings, fades. A petty officer would point at a smudge and say, "That's him, he's tired," because a captain late on schedule might be pushing his reactor to make up time, and that push had a sound. This was a world where emotion hid inside math. Meanwhile, engineers chased every decibel. Longer arrays, tighter filters, beamforming that could slice the ocean into pencils of listening. Computers were crude but relentless, building archives of signatures that turned into training libraries. When a brand new class appeared, the first capture of its voice went into a safe, copied to a second, and became a reference. We weren't just listening, we were curating. But there was one problem that sat like a shadow under all that success. The wall assumed the adversary's noise floor. We believed in their loudness. Our processing thresholds, our alerting logic, even the places we put the arrays, were calibrated to what we thought they were. If that changed, whether by better machining, smarter operations, or a peek at how we listened, the balance would tilt fast. And because each piece of the system was isolated, recognizing that tilt would be slow, fragmented, easy to explain away. Still, by the mid-1960s into the 1970s, the invisible wall did what it promised. Patrol aircraft launched on cues, sonarbys splashed, and attack submarines were vectored to handoffs that felt like routine. The Navy budget reflected that confidence. Arrays expanded. Processing centers grew. Careers were built on the claim that the ocean's whispers were enough to keep cities safe. There's a micro-story the old hands tell. A watch floor in Barbados, night shift, coffee gone cold. A bearing line holds steady on a contact coming through the gap. The petty officer yawns, calls it in. 2 hours later, the line tilts a degree left, small but wrong for the drift. He taps the gram writer, checks the paper feed, rezeros the stylus. The line stays wrong. That's not the ocean, he says. He changed something. They log it, tag the tape, and move on. The note disappears into a folder. While that was happening in New London, a different folder got thicker with charts of transit corridors, red pencil lines showing timings that worked 9 times out of 10. The 10th, someone would blame weather, or shipping noise, or a sick gram writer. Nobody wanted to say the bus schedule had changed. Then a boat appeared where it shouldn't. Not a dramatic reveal, just a contact reported by a patrol aircraft in clean water that should have been cluttered if our lanes were right. An analyst circled the time and underlined it twice. The memo went up and the answer came back cautious. Monitor. Confidence still hummed, but the hum had a wobble. Someone somewhere had touched the wall. The first, cracks in the water. 3 days after that wobble in the hum, a patrol aircraft called in a contact off the Carolinas. Clean water, wrong lane. The crew expected a noisy diesel trawler. Instead, the sonoboys painted a tidy ladder, narrowband and disciplined. It matched a Soviet attack boat that should have been 100 miles east, riding a corridor we knew by heart. The report crossed desks with a penciled question mark. The return message was measured. Verify environmental factors. Stakes first. If lanes were shifting, it meant patrol aircraft would splash buoys into silence and US boats would prowl blind in water they thought they owned. Crews would push forward to compensate, accepting collision risk to keep coverage honest. Families would wait longer for word from deployments that were supposed to be predictable. The invisible wall only worked if the map held. On the watch floors, arguments got quiet and sharp. Oceanographers pointed to temperature inversions and a deepening thermocline. The layer moved, sound bent, one said, tapping a chart. Operators pushed back. It bent for them and not for us. A junior analyst slid a LOFAR-gram across the table. The usual fleet of machinery tones was thinner, smoother. The messy sidebands, those little burrs that made the Soviet boats feel human, were shaved down. Cleaner, he said. The word hung like a threat. Action moved to a briefing room with the blinds shut and the projector humming. A slide read, anomalous transit, GIUK deviation. Another, East Coast lane misalignment. The next one was only 4 words, possible operational adaptation. A captain in the back cleared his throat and said what no one wanted to, or compromise. Head stayed still. The briefer clicked ahead to currents and seasonal whale migrations, safer ground. Someone scribbled SOSUS thresholds in the margin of a handout and folded it into a pocket. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Norfolk. A quiet memo made the rounds. Acoustic signatures exhibit reduced modulation artifacts, potential maintenance improvements. That sounded like good news. Soviets getting better at their boats meant we were chasing a worthy adversary. But a senior civilian scrawled a line on the bottom, or they know what artifacts matter. This was the moment everything changed for the operators in Iceland. They'd been told to trust the cross-fixes. Bearings from multiple arrays should intersect cleanly if the ocean behaved. Now the intersections smeared, not enough to kill confidence, just enough to make a watchstander twitch before calling a fix. That twitch multiplied across shifts and stations. The ocean felt wrong, but wrong in a way that could be explained away at every step. A micro-story passed in whispers. A NAVFAC petty officer flagged a behavioral pivot on a boat he tracked for 3 nights, a dip into the thermal layer at precisely the bearing change point that used to be their giveaway. He wrote, "He's hiding under the layer when we expect to climb." The note got a polite acknowledgement and a request for more examples. He taped a photograph of the gram next to the coffee pot and underlined the time. 2 days later, someone took it down. At the fleet level, commanders shifted grids. Patrol arcs widened. An order came through to increase forward presence near the shelf break. The intercept rate dipped, not catastrophic, but noticeable to the people who lived in the numbers. Excuses multiplied. A storm here, a cable fault there, a maintenance window that overlapped a transit. Each sounded reasonable. Together they formed a pattern no one could name without sticking their neck out. Then a briefing labeled recap. Anomalies floated a harder line. Possible compromise of assumptions. Not systems, not keys, assumptions. A colonel argued that the Soviets had achieved genuine quieting. He referenced new propeller designs and shaft mounts rumored in open-source papers. Another officer pushed his chair back and said, "If they know our thresholds, they don't need new propellers. They need discipline." The room sat with that for a beat. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody knew at the time was playing out in hallways between secure vaults. 2 analysts from different commands compared notes over a vending machine coffee. One said, "My lanes are ghosting at shift change windows." The other said, "Mine too, but only when we rotate watch teams." They laughed it off, coincidence, operator variance. But later, alone at his desk, one of them pulled an old file. Compromise indicators, operational. The checklist was sparse. He checked nothing and closed the folder. Across town, a rumor surfaced with no source anyone could pin down. Not a defector, an insider. The word felt sticky in the mouth. Security told everyone to review printing logs. Supervisors glanced at after-hours access slips. A chief asked a communicator why he was doing admin work late. Their answer, retyping watch bills, was boring enough to pass. impact built quietly. SOSUS stations reported clean lanes where historical clutter should have been. The graphs that used to look like weather now looked like a desert. Field officers started saying it out loud to each other. "They're walking around us." A classified memo, sharp, almost angry, warned, "We're measuring our own assumptions." It got filed under internal, stamped with a date, and went nowhere public. Meanwhile, at a dining room table in a suburban house, a relative gathered up courage and a stack of grievances. Fear, money, a broken promise. The phone call they were about to make would start the unraveling. But in this moment, the fleet still told itself a story about oceans and seasons, and the man with the grocery bags was still copying. Meet the mole. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a Navy communicator with a gift for procedures and a life that leaked money. The rank said dependable, the mailbox said past due. He knew where the crypto safes were, who signed for key lists when the watch changed, and which clerks were sloppy with carbons. In uniform, he was invisible, precisely the kind of man you trust with routines. Off duty, he counted tips from a side job that didn't cover the credit cards and told himself a story about temporary. You think you know how betrayal looks, dramatic, cinematic. But wait, here's the twist. It looks like routine done slightly wrong for years. The first rationalization landed on a weekday afternoon. A code supplement photocopied for a training packet, then slid into a manila envelope that stayed in his briefcase too long. He looked at it that night like it was contraband and insurance at once. In his head, he rehearsed the phrase that would let him sleep. Nobody gets hurt by paper. He missed the second phrase forming underneath. Paper changes everything. Det made the first meeting easy. A parking lot behind a strip mall, sodium lights buzzing, a tired sedan that rolled up without headlights. The handler looked like a traveling salesman, carried a folded newspaper, and spoke in the rhythm of someone who'd practiced this 100 times. The envelope passed through a cracked window. A handshake never happened. Cash came back, small, neat, counted twice. The line was simple. Bring what helps us here less. Not more, less. He nodded without asking what that meant, because the answer was obvious if you lived inside circuits. Thresholds, timings, the bones of how we listen. Tradecraft tightened fast. No more parking lots except when staged. Dead drops under a loose brick behind a pharmacy. Grocery bags with eggs on top and a binder underneath. Coded notes in ballpoint on a postcard that mentioned a fake aunt's birthday. He learned to double bag for rain, to wipe edges, to flatten staples. He bought a second wallet and a third story about where he'd been. At home, his wife noticed the late nights at admin and the new stereo that didn't match the paycheck. He said a chief had promised him overtime. It sounded boring enough to pass. The product grew because success feels like permission. It started with key lists, those printed settings that made machines speak in tongues, then call signs and routing indicators, the breadcrumbs that let you map who talks to whom. Movement schedules, too, convoy windows, rendezvous points, the quiet patterns of ships slipping out and back. He threw in acoustic intelligence primers he barely understood, memos about tonals and harmonics, because he'd heard a lieutenant call them crown jewels. The handler circled those in red and slid them back with a request written like a favor. Locations, not just theory. Meanwhile, something else was happening in his head. He stopped looking people in the eye when they signed the custody log. He made jokes about bureaucracy to cover why he lingered near the copier. He developed a ritual, wipe the platen, count the sheets, breathe, like that could keep the act from owning him. A colleague asked, casually, why he'd been retyping watch bills at 220. Getting ahead, he said, and forced a laugh that sounded close enough. A micro-story. One Tuesday he reached for a restricted binder with dry hands and left a smudge on the metal clasp. He didn't notice until he set it down and saw the crescent. He wiped it with a cuff that had already brushed ink. It smeared. His heart raced so loud he almost missed the door click. A junior petty officer poked her head in, saw the mess, and said, "Sir, you okay?" He answered with a grin that felt like cardboard. "New ink pad. It's bleeding." She nodded and backed out. He sat there 5 minutes longer, staring at the smear until it looked like an exit wound. The handler never wasted words. He praised consistency and punished risk. No visits, no faces, no improvisation. But he also ratcheted the asks. What are the detection thresholds by band? Which arrays are down for maintenance this quarter? How often do they rotate crypto on fleet broadcast? Each answer wasn't just a fact. It was a haircut taken off the invisible wall. They didn't need to break the ears. They needed to skate under them. Here's where it shifts. He realized they wanted the ocean's ears themselves. The map of coverage, the gaps, the failure modes. That meant SOSUS. He didn't have direct access to array locations, but he knew who did and what forms carried hints. He collected scraps. A travel order to a quiet NAVFAC with a too long name. A budget line item for cable repair that hinted at a latitude band. A briefing slide about processing anomalies that listed sites in a harmless footer. He assembled them like a kid, building a model without instructions. The picture that emerged would let someone plan patrols that grazed the layer, ducked under beams, and surfaced in our blind corners. He crossed a line on a Sunday. The office was empty except for a humming soda machine and the smell of waxed floors. He took a restricted annex off a shelf, laid it open near the copier, and photographed pages with a cheap camera he'd bought at a drugstore. No paper, no toner, just light on film. When he rewound, the camera clicked louder than he expected. He flinched. No one came. He told himself that would be the last time. It was, because once you sell silence, every quiet day pays you back. Unknown to him, across town, someone had already dialed the FBI. And at sea, a US boat slid through a lane expecting a shadow that never showed. The keys to the kingdom, what was sold. Stakes first. What he carried wasn't gossip. It was the operating system of the Navy's voice. Crypto keys came printed on drab sheets, monthly, weekly, sometimes daily, telling machines how to scramble and unscramble fleet traffic. With those key lists, the Soviets didn't need to break math. They just had the combination. 1 million messages turned from static into sentences, orders to sail, maintenance reports, situation updates from submarines that were supposed to be whispers in the dark. The risk wasn't just that they could read us, it was timing. Read in real time, a message about a patrol window becomes a waypoint. Action looked boring. He'd signed for a sealed pouch, log the serial, and at the copier, lift just enough to catch the columns that mattered: date, net, edition, effective period. For systems like KW7 and KL47, those columns were gold. The handler taught him to prioritize what rolled into the fleet broadcast, the nervous system connecting shore to every boat at sea. With that, an adversary could watch the pulse of a fleet. When the pulse spiked, they'd slow. When it dipped, they'd sprint. He wasn't stealing words. He was selling cadence. And that cadence, read against GIUK gap habits and SOSUS sites, turned into a traffic map of the Atlantic. Then came patrol patterns. Not grand strategy, but routes, timing windows, and rendezvous points smuggled out of innocuous movement messages. A submarine's life is rhythm: leave, transit, patrol, return. He fed the Soviets the beats. A quiet note about a replenishment at a certain longitude became a fence post in the water. Stack enough fence posts and you don't need a map, you need confidence. The handler's reaction was immediate: more of this. And he added a line that chilled even in memory: we prefer windows ahead of time. With crypto, ahead was possible. He layered in acoustic intelligence primers he barely understood. Thin manuals and briefings that explained how we heard. Narrowband tonals, harmonic ladders, modulation artifacts, the very signatures that watchstanders used to label classes and sometimes hulls. The primers didn't give away array locations. They revealed philosophy, what frequencies we watched, which combinations triggered alerts, and which we called clutter. That mattered. If you know your opponent treats a certain sideband as noise, you can shape your machinery to hide under it. If you know they key on a blade rate harmonic, you grind the blade to smooth the nick. This wasn't magic. It was maintenance with an instruction sheet. Meanwhile, a subtler category slid across his kitchen table: SOSUS vulnerabilities written between lines. He never held a chart with pins in the seafloor, but he carried fragments. A repair requisition naming a cable ship and a latitude band. A processing memo about beamforming degradation at a site whose name gave away a coastline. a budget line that only made sense if an array curved where the deep sound channel bowed. Each piece alone meant little. In a vault across an ocean, they were assembled into a silhouette. Not exact, but enough to thread a submarine along the margins of our listening. He found the meta-secret almost by accident, what the US believed about Soviet noise floors. Our models assumed their boats radiated at certain levels by class and speed. Those numbers drove alert thresholds and search doctrine. He copied a slide deck that laid the assumptions out like gospel. The handler didn't smile often. He smiled then. Because if you know the noise line your enemy expects, you can run your boat just under it. Slow on bearings, pumps set to a narrow band, speeds chosen not for efficiency, but to hover under our math. Impact came in two flavors. Immediate. Soviet operators altered behavior. They hugged thermal layers exactly where our processors struggled to discriminate. They scheduled depth changes not when convenient, but when bearings intersected array beams. They set maintenance standards to reduce the messy sidebands we'd gotten used to as tells. Crews learned to tune their own ships as instruments. Ripple. Our intercept opportunities fell. Not to zero, but down enough that planners felt it. Patrol aircraft launched on cues that arrived late or not at all. Submarines tasked to trail found themselves sniffing in dead water where a year earlier they'd have had a solid start. Here's the twist. You think quieting was only engineering, but discipline powered by stolen thresholds did as much damage as new propellers. Here's where it gets precise. Crypto keys didn't just open messages. They let the Soviets measure our reaction times. A message out at 20, a response at 2:13. Now they knew how long our machines took to turn, how quickly a tasking flowed from an intel center to a flight line. With that, they shaped their own timing, crossing choke points during our shift changes, diving under layers when our watch reliefs were reading in. That's not a myth. It's how professionals exploit any system, not by breaking it, by reading its habits. The list of what he sold kept lengthening. Call signs that mapped units to voices, routing indicators that exposed who was in the loop, signal plans that flagged when nets switched and who had precedence during exercises, training schedules that, to an enemy, looked like quiet corridors. He handed over a glossary of our own shorthand, what sitrep packets carried in practice, how a flash differed from an immediate in time, not theory. Each detail shaved a little more off the margin for error that keeps collisions theoretical and deterrence credible. Meanwhile, as the paperwork moved, dots vanished from screens. Watchstanders who used to call confident fixes now labeled possible, then weak, then nothing. A LOFARgram that used to look like a picket fence thinned into a comb with missing teeth. Operations blamed environment. Research labs wrote papers about new propellers and shaft isolation. Both were partly true. What nobody at the watch floor knew was that their own playbook, the thresholds, the biases baked into processing, had been delivered in manila envelopes to a man who told his captains, "Run here, not there. Now, not then." Consequence, years of advantage eroded. Not by war, by calibration. The Soviets didn't need to make silent submarines overnight. They made knowable ones, knowable in the way our ears worked. And because our confidence was built on patterns, when those patterns bent, it felt like weather. Until the chart with missed intercepts stacked up enough to feel like weather with intent. He didn't see any of that on board. He saw cash counted out and a handler's shorthand praise. But the fleet felt it. The ocean went a little darker each month, and in offices with no windows, the question got sharper. What else did he sell? The Pentagon's blind side. While paperwork moved in grocery bags, the view from Washington looked tidy. Quarterly briefs showed fewer detections, but the slide titles called it Soviet Quieting Progress and Environmental Variance. A tidy story plays well in big rooms. Engineers could talk about Victor III propellers and improved shaft isolation. Oceanographers could point at shifting layers. Fewer dots on maps became a success narrative the budgeteers could live with. Stakes first. If headquarters reads a dip as good news, the fleet takes more risk to keep the charts looking healthy. Crews extend forward, patrol aircraft launch on thin queues, and submarine skippers accept tighter trails in busier water. The blind side wasn't ignorance, it was optimism. That's lethal in a business built on margins. Action started with dueling reports. On one side, lab papers citing Victor III advances and third-generation Soviet boats with improved shaft isolation. On the other, field memos from Iceland and Norfolk muttering about behavioral pivots and layer hugging. A classified note landed on a deputy's desk. IUSS reporting decreased narrowband persistence. Recommend review of processing thresholds. He scrawled, coordinate with NUSC, and forwarded it to a committee that met monthly and produced minutes no one read twice. A budget review turned irony into policy. A line officer, proud and tired, briefed that our improved classification discipline meant fewer false contacts. The graph dipped, the room nodded. A senior civilian clapped quietly and said, efficiency. In the back, a captain whispered to a colleague, we're congratulating ourselves for missing things. The colleague didn't reply. Careers ride on curves that bend down. You think you know, but confirmation bias wears a uniform and a smile. Meanwhile, turf lines hardened. Intel wanted more assets on collection tasking and argued that operations overpromised tracking. Operations shot back that the labs were recalibrating processes to flatter their own models. The labs, bruised and certain, said the fleet was drawing conclusions from anecdotes. Everyone was right in their lane and wrong about the ocean. A memo with teeth finally surfaced from an analyst who refused to let syntax hide the problem. We're measuring our own assumptions. He laid it out in 3 bullets: threshold bias, confirmation loops in cross-skewing, and the danger of comparing today's clean grams to last year's messy ones and calling it progress. It got stamped secret and briefed to a deputy who said, good work, fold it into the quarterly. Folding is another word for dulling. In the hallways, field officers spoke plainly. They're walking around us. A commander from Keflavik told a visiting staffer, your slides don't match the water. The staffer nodded, promised to take it back, and added, we're seeing strong modeling of Soviet quieting. The commander stared and said, model this, my guys are launching on ghosts. Impact rippled. A quiet directive went out, expand arrays and update processing, buy time without admitting doubt. Contracts were written for longer lines and better beamforming. The cover story said modernization, the subtext said fear. Training syllabi added anomaly hunting modules. Watchstanders were told to flag out-of-family behavior, code for, we don't know what's happening, help us see it. Unknown to many, a small group met after hours in a windowless room with a laminated map of the North Atlantic. They laid transparent overlays on top, array coverage models, reported Soviet routes, our assumed noise floors. The overlays didn't match like they used to. One analyst tapped a corner over the shelf break and said, this is where they're disappearing. A program manager answered, we'll add SURTASS coverage. The analyst replied, they'll adapt to that too if they're reading our pulse. Inside Navy headquarters, a colonel tried a different tack. He proposed a red team, take our own assumptions, flip them, and run simulated Soviet patrols to find where we'd miss. The brief earned polite smiles and a tasker to coordinate interagency. Interagency meant weeks. The ocean didn't care. A micro-story slipped through. A lieutenant tasked to reconcile detection logs with message traffic noticed that our response times clustered around watch turnovers and maintenance windows. He wrote, adversary movement appears to exploit our predictable latency. His boss redlined adversary and wrote potential adversary. The lieutenant changed the word and sent it back. Precision felt like a betrayal of caution. At sea, skippers felt the blind side in their bones. One admitted in a closed session, I didn't call the ladder as a target of opportunity because the cross-fix was soft. He expected a reprimand. Instead, the senior nodded. We're all hesitating. That's the cost the slides don't show. Hesitation where muscle memory used to live. Then the mole got bold. He reached for annexes that spelled out processor alerting logic and maintenance downtimes by sight. Those pages turned quiet lanes into planned corridors. Bold men make mistakes. He logged a document under the wrong code, and a clerk noticed the anomaly. It didn't trigger an arrest. It triggered a question, the first of many, and questions survive even across bureaucracies. The blind side began to narrow when someone at the Pentagon said the thing out loud in a room that mattered. Assume compromise. Prove it or fix it. Not an admission, a pivot. Processing thresholds were reset. Keys were changed faster and rotated unpredictably. Access audits got teeth. The directive didn't name the man. It named the problem. Certainty had become a liability. Near misses and narrow escapes. While that directive filtered down, surveillance picked up a tremor near a dead drop. An FBI team clocked a car that shouldn't have been there, a sedan circling twice, then idling by the pharmacy with a loose brick. Stakes were real. Catch him sloppy and you cut the bleed. Tip him off and he fades for years. They watched the driver step out, check his watch and drift to the alley. He reached for the brick, then froze. Sirens somewhere not close, but close enough to rattle. He pivoted, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and walked back to the car. The team debated moving. They didn't. He lived to make another drop. Action shifted to the office. A colleague noticed the communicator's habit of staying late for admin. She asked, light but pointed, why the copy room counter spiked after 220. He smiled and said he was fixing watch bills and training packets, tedious work nobody else wanted. She raised an eyebrow and asked about a missing code supplement. He produced a plausible story about a misfilling that gave just enough detail to be boring. The chief gave him a warning for sloppiness, not a charge. The door clicked shut behind him, and he exhaled like he'd surfaced. Meanwhile, a small surveillance unit tailed him to a strip mall copy shop. He walked in empty-handed and came out with a manila envelope tucked under newspaper. The clerk remembered cash, exact change, and a polite man who never looked up. The cameras were old, the tape grainy. They clocked the license plate, but held back. Building the pattern mattered more than scoring the arrest. At home, friction sharpened. His wife saw cash that didn't match overtime and a new stereo that felt like a dare. He called it a side gig fixing electronics for a buddy from the base. She asked for a name. He gave one from a roster she'd never seen. Later that week, she found a receipt beneath the car seat for film development, 2 sets of prints, rush service. He said he was digitizing old family photos. She didn't argue. She folded the receipt into her wallet like a fuse. The handler pushed. Locations, not just theory. The request meant SOSUS, meant physicality, where the ears were when they slept, how they failed. The communicator probed the edges of his access. He borrowed a binder from a friend in a different section and returned it with fingerprints on the metal, a tiny crescent he missed under the clasp. A junior petty officer noticed and made a note for a routine audit. The note sat in a tray under a paperweight shaped like a ship. He made a dead drop on a rainy night and misjudged the bag. The bottom softened, the binder sleeve slid, and a corner flashed under streetlight before he shoved it deeper. Across the street, a man with an umbrella paused, then kept walking. The communicator spent the next week checking windows and mirrors, certain the umbrella was a tail. Paranoia made him careful, and careful kept him alive. A micro story. The Bureau staged a brush pass with a fake document, an irresistible memo about processor, alert thresholds and maintenance downtimes. They planted it in a stack he could access, watermarked in a way only they could see. He took the bait, copied it, and the watermark fluoresced under a lamp in a safe house across town. But the Bureau didn't move. They wanted to see who collected, who controlled, and whether this was a family enterprise or a larger ring. Patience heard, but haste would lose the rest. Inside the command, the communicator got a quiet talking to about a missing annex that later turned up misfiled. He performed contrition with precision. He fixed 3 other filing errors no one had flagged, gave a half-day lecture on custody logs, and wrote a memo on best practices that got him a commendation. The applause insulated him. Then came the closest call. Security ran a random audit on printer use. His late-night spikes lit up. He stayed in the chair, hands on knees, while a lieutenant asked about the pattern. He produced a calendar with check marks that matched training cycles and watch bill prep, even pulled a stack of innocuous copies from his drawer to prove volume. The lieutenant frowned, then nodded. "Log your after-hours prints," he said. The communicator nodded back, logged nothing different, and switched to a camera again. The handler's next ask sounded like a dare. List the crypto changeover windows for fleet broadcast over the next quarter. He didn't have the list, but he knew where it lived. He waited for a Sunday, slid the folder to the copier and took photos instead of prints. On the way out, he ran into the same junior petty officer from weeks before. She held up a coffee and said, "You're always here on Sundays." He smiled thinly. "Quieter," he said. She said, "Yeah," and let him pass. At sea, a US submarine expected to pick up a shadow at the shelf break, an old reliable. The lane was clean. The skipper extended farther forward, heart rate up, crew keyed to whispers that never came. Back on shore, the communicator dropped a bag behind the brick. This time, he double-bagged against the rain. The bureau watched from a van with fogged windows and wrote one word on a legal pad: patient. The ocean goes dark. Multiple patrol cycles came and went with gaps where there shouldn't have been gaps. On the watch floors, the old hands stopped cracking jokes and started counting quiet hours. SOSUS stations sent up reports of clean lanes, places that in memory were always messy with cross traffic and harmonic clutter. The grams that used to look like city skylines at night turned into empty horizons. A few operators whispered the same phrase without coordination: "The water feels empty." Stakes sharpened fast. Empty water doesn't just bruise pride, it changes how you sail. If you can't cue from the wall, you push forward with hulls and people. Commanders shifted from cue and intercept to hunt and hope, a different kind of risk. Trail assignments got tighter. The phrase collision envelope started showing up in briefings not as theory, but as a thing to plan around. The invisible wall had always kept distance between hunters. Now that distance shrank. Action cut between stations. In Wales, a watchstander pointed to a gram with barely their blades and said, "He's under the layer." The supervisor told him to mark it possible. In Iceland, a junior sailor tracked a contact that dipped precisely at the point where beams feathered. It faded cleanly instead of fuzzing out. He wrote, "behavioral pivot," because he'd heard the term in a training update. In Barbados, an operator who'd been doing this since the early 60s pulled an old tape for comparison and went quiet. The difference wasn't just level, it was discipline. Meanwhile, analysts flagged something they didn't have a word for yet. The Soviets weren't just quieter, they were behaving in shapes tailored to our processing. Depth changes at shift change windows, course adjustments at array beam borders, speed schedules that clipped under expected blade rate lines. Someone scrawled on a whiteboard, "They're reading our rhythm," and erased it before the next brief. Impact spread beyond maps. Intercept opportunities slid down by double digits in certain corridors. Patrol aircraft launched on cues that were thinner later or wrong. Crews came back with sonobuoy logs full of weather and whales and not much else. Sub-skippers wrote after-action notes that sounded like confessions. Extended forward without cue. No contact. Fuel penalty accepted. Fuel was code for risk. Inside a midnight meeting, a real one, blinds down, coffee bitter, an admiral set the tone. Assume compromise, prove it or fix it. It wasn't an accusation, it was math. Keys rotated off-cycle, thresholds were reset. Training packets added drills that forced watchstanders to break habits. A memo went out to keep success quiet. Don't teach the adversary what we've noticed. That memo was read, initialed, and locked away. At sea, doctrine shifted. Forward tracking replaced comfortable handoffs. The word ambush crept back into plans like it belonged more than anyone wanted to admit. Private conversations between captains turned blunt. If the wall can't cue us, we become the wall. It sounded heroic at a distance and exhausting up close. The human cost showed up in sleep cycles and clipped temper. A micro-story from Keflavik. A watch section logged 3 hours of nothing in a corridor that never came up empty. The petty officer tore the strip off the gramwriter, folded it in thirds, and wrote on the back, "If he's there, he's riding the layer edge like a rail." He stuck it under a magnet on the fridge where the stale donuts lived. By morning, the strip was gone and replaced by a typed sign about keeping the area clean. Processing labs scrambled. Engineers pulled apart alerting logic and found bias they'd installed themselves. Filters that had treated certain modulations as clutter because 5 years ago they were. They patched, tuned, added adaptive thresholds that could shift with water and adversary, but they knew they were chasing. You can feel when you're reacting to someone else's lead. Across town, counterintelligence made the kitchen table turn. The relative who'd been weighing fear against blood flipped to fear. They called. The tip wasn't elegant. It was human, cash that didn't fit, lies that didn't hold, a temper that grew when questions landed too close. The FBI moved from pattern to person. They pulled bank records, parking lot cameras, and copy shop logs. Threads tightened. The ocean stayed dark, but there was now a path to a light switch. Here's where things get interesting. Betrayal at home often beats any censor at sea. On the fleet side, commanders began to write 2 plans for every patrol. One if the wall spoke like it used to, one if it didn't. The second plan had words no one had trained for in years. Creep, linger, listen with your own hull, trust your bow array over the picture you expected. Risk planners updated collision matrices. A quiet fear crept in that the next incident wouldn't be theory, but steel on steel. Meanwhile, a chart landed on a desk in the Pentagon with intercept opportunities plotted month over month. The line bent down where budgets and briefs had claimed it would bend up. Someone drew a box around the dip and wrote in small letters, "Stop calling this improvement." Then came a moment on a US boat that nobody forgot. They were set up for a handoff near the shelf break, an old textbook maneuver. The queue was late and thin, but habit made them trust it. They eased into the slot and felt nothing. The ocean has a feel when another hull is near, pressure, pattern, a life. It wasn't there. The skipper made a call that risked his report card and saved his crew. He pulled back. Later, in a closed debrief, he said, "I didn't like trusting a picture built by someone who might be reading it with me." Chairs creaked. No one wrote that down. The midnight directive echoed. Assume compromise, prove it or fix it. Fixing took time. Proving took a kitchen table, a relative with a steady voice, and a knock that wouldn't make the news. While that moved, the ocean stayed darker than anyone was ready to admit out loud. Unraveling the spy. The kitchen table call didn't sound like history. It sounded like a relative who'd run out of patience. Fear mixed with spite, details scattered but sharp enough to cut. Late nights, cash that didn't fit, film receipts, a temper when questions got near anything labeled crypto. The FBI logged the name, thanked the caller, and started the quiet work. No sirens, no headlines, just a file that grew by inches. They began with the unglamorous. Bank records showed deposits that pulsed off cycle from Navy pay, not big enough to scream, regular enough to suggest a second heartbeat. Parking lot cameras near a copy shop caught a familiar sedan at odd hours, and a clerk remembered exact change, 2 sets of prints, rush service. The team drew a simple line on a whiteboard with 3 dots, bank, shop, late shift, and wrote the name above it in block letters. No arrows yet. You think arrests are about a single smoking gun. They're about patterns that don't blink. Surveillance settled in. A sedan 2 blocks back, a borrowed apartment across from the pharmacy with the loose brick, an agent who learned the rhythm of his cigarette breaks. He still felt lucky from the last near miss. The rain, the bag, the siren that wasn't for him, and luck makes people repeat themselves. He drove the same route twice, circled the same lot, checked the mirror at the same light. Patterns make cases. The Bureau tested him with patience. They seeded a brush pass in his workspace, a memo with irresistible bones, processor alert logic and maintenance downtimes, watermarked in a way only they could see. He lifted it, photographed it, and the watermark lit in a safe house across town under a fluorescent lamp. They didn't move, not yet. They wanted the chain, the handler, the habit that would tie damage to method. Inside his command, a small audit finally connected a smudge to a missing annex, and a missing annex to a late-night print spike. A lieutenant with a talent for boredom traced custody logs line by line and found the same name too often near the copier counter after midnight. He flagged it, closed the folder carefully, and walked it to security. The memo that came back said, "Monitor, do not tip." That word, monitor, kept the bleed going and kept the trap clean. At home, the story frayed. His wife compared the calendar of overtime with the bank pulse and felt the click when lies stopped fitting. She found a film receipt and didn't accept the line about digitizing old photos. She called the relative who'd already called the FBI and said, "I'm done." Fear shifted to resolve. That's when cases turn. The FBI staged a brush pass in a parking lot behind a grocery store. An undercover walked by with a newspaper folded to a crossword and a manila envelope tucked inside. The communicator took the cue, made the switch, and kept walking, clean hands, steady pace. The teams in 2 cars let him go. They had their pattern. Now they wanted the stash. Search warrants landed like feathers. Not a battering ram, a knock at dawn with badges and a calm voice. The office locker yielded nothing dramatic, clean binders, a commendation for custody discipline, a checklist with his own neat handwriting. The car gave up fibers and a single strip of leader from a roll of film wedged under a seat rail. The house offered fragments, a binder sleeve with the faint outline of a watermark cut line, grocery bags folded in a stack with one corner creased like it had once caught a spine, a receipt for 2 rolls developed on a date that matched a drop. None of it shouted, all of it pointed. They found the camera in a shoebox, cheap and ordinary, with film dust in the grooves. In the garage, a spot on the workbench lit under blacklight, residue from a watermark he didn't know was there. In a jacket pocket, a note card with a grocery list in his wife's hand, and in the corner, a number that matched the code for a fleet broadcast key list, written small as if to hide from himself. The agents photographed everything before they touched it, then bagged it in silence. They brought him in on a Tuesday, not long after lunch, to a room with a table that looked like every other table he'd ever sat at for briefings. The first hour was friendly, small corrections, shared institutions, the kind of talk that makes you feel like you're almost colleagues. Then the photos came out, the watermark glow, the parking lot switch, the film receipt stamped with a time that matched a night he'd said he was doing admin. He tried denial first, then indignation, then expertise. You don't know how this works. They did. And that's when it gets really wild. The quiet man in the copy room had tilted a nuclear balance. He asked for a lawyer. They paused, left the room, came back with a different tone and a new line. This is bigger than you. He tried the one last job lie, an attempt to sell them a rope to pull. They had their own rope. When he realized the conversation had shifted from if to how much, he slumped, then straightened, then stared at the cheap ceiling tile like there might be a map up there. The arrest hit like a whisper. No press, no staged perp walk, just handcuffs that clicked with the same precision as the machines he'd once kept honest. He rode an elevator down with 2 agents who didn't speak and stepped into a hallway that smelled like floor wax. In another building, a task force started pinning pins on a wall, who touched what, when, and circled the years the ocean went dark. Capturing the man was easy. Measuring what vanished through him would take seasons. Damage assessment, counting the invisible losses. They called it a task force, but it felt like a morgue for missing sounds. A circle of analysts, operators, and quiet civilians pinned years on a wall and started threading string between events and envelopes. Stakes were brutal. If you can't see what you lost, you can't rebuild trust. Every missed contact might be a patrol that got close enough to matter. Every decrypted message might be timing handed to a captain who slid past our ears. They began with a map of everything he touched. Crypto key lists first, cross-referenced against fleet broadcast logs. They overlaid Soviet patrol cycles we'd pieced together from fragments with the windows when keys were blown. Red-shaded months, yellow weeks, green days. The red spread. One analyst slid a ruler across the cluster and said, "This is a conversation, not a coincidence." When keys were compromised, detections dipped. Not everywhere, not always, just enough to reveal a pulse. Action moved to the grams. They pulled LOFAR grams from stations he'd indirectly exposed, sites named in footers, hinted by travel orders, betrayed by budgets, and compared before to after. Before had burrs and human mess. After had discipline. The narrowband ladders didn't vanish. They thinned and tucked under thresholds we documented in our own primers. The team made a list labeled missed because we taught them, and it got longer by the hour. They reconstructed the window. Start with his first key delivery. Layer in the handler's asks for processor logic and array downtimes. Add patrol pattern disclosures and rendezvous hints. The result was a period measured in years, late 1960s through mid-1980s, when Soviet boats could plan against our listening, not in theory but in practice. The question that chilled the room was how many. It was which ones held missiles. The answer lived in a classified drawer. The drawer opened. Silence did the rest. Impact was counted in opportunities lost. They built a ledger, expected intercepts versus realized Q-to-contact time before and after, trail initiations that never achieved handoff. Numbers stripped away the excuses. Environmental variance accounted for some. Genuine quieting accounted for more. But a slice, too big to ignore, mapped to knowledge they shouldn't have had unless someone gave it to them. Someone did. Retroactive risk got ugly. Launch points we couldn't see, timelines we guessed. A thin, stamped page from a war game years earlier showed a simulated first night of war. The assumed positions of enemy ballistic missile submarines were based on patterns we'd trusted. The task force overlaid the compromised window. Some of those positions were ghosts. A colonel stared at the overlay too long and then folded it once, carefully, like a flag. Meanwhile, the human audit cut deep. Commanders wrote classified admissions, pushed forward due to lack of Q, acceptable risk at the time. Watchstanders confessed to changing their own thresholds to avoid false alarms they'd been told were bad metrics. Engineers admitted bias in filters they designed to ignore artifacts that had become the adversary's shelter. Together, it formed a culture autopsy as much as a damage report. Then the quiet retooling orders went out. Change keys faster, unpredictably, and alter the way we distribute them. Rotate routes and timing windows for our own boats so any pattern they'd learned died on contact. Rewrite doctrine for queuing, less dependence on a single layer of sensing, more on fusion and anomaly. The instruction included a line underlined twice. Do not signal. Assume our corrective action is observed. Fix it without telling them we know. Budget shock followed. You don't rebuild an ocean's ears with coffee money. Billions shifted on paper to arrays, to processing that could adapt in motion, to training that taught watchstanders to distrust their comfort. Programs with loud futures were trimmed to feed the quiet present. Someone joked that we were buying doubt. He wasn't wrong. Doubt became a line item. The verdict was written in a tone that avoided drama because the facts didn't need it. Years of advantage traded for envelopes of cash and a handler's quiet praise. The counterintelligence report avoided the word catastrophic and landed on strategically significant. It added a sentence that felt like a sentence. Deterrent's credibility depends on unseen margins. Those margins were reduced. People in rooms with no windows read that twice. A micro-story surfaced from the task force's long nights. An analyst who'd learned grams at Barbados found her own handwriting on an old tape box from the 60s, a note calling a bearing line tilt, not the ocean. She traced the thread through decades to a policy change that had adjusted thresholds up to avoid false positives. She closed the loop with a finger and said, almost to herself, "We taught ourselves what to miss." She didn't cry. She sharpened a pencil and kept working. They didn't put out a press release. They briefed a handful of people and then buried the rest in vaults. Families of sailors never heard words like window or quieting acceleration. What they got were new schedules and longer deployments. Inside, a quiet memo closed the assessment with a line that cut both ways. We will never know all that slipped by. It wasn't an excuse. It was an operating condition. Fixing the shield required admitting it was never a wall. The task force, exhausted and a little older, slid their strings and pins into a box and wrote a single word on the lid. Assumptions. Then they started on the next binder. How to rebuild without teaching the water how to trick us again. Rebuilding the shield in silence. They didn't hold a ribbon cutting. They rewired the ocean in whispers. The first order was simple and ruthless. Stop trusting single lines. The static wall became a layered hunt, fixed arrays, towed arrays, shipboard sensors, and the quietest submarines slipping into places the wall never reached. Layered wasn't a buzzword. It was survival. If one ear was fooled, the others could catch the echo. Processing changed from cataloging to pattern of life. Instead of asking, "Does this look like a victor?" the machines learned to ask, "Does this movement belong here now?" Engineers built models that knew what normal sounded like on a Tuesday in February and flagged deviations, even if the narrowband tones were clean. Anomaly hunting replaced signature worship. The ocean went from a zoo of species to a neighborhood watch. That demanded new math. The labs pulled apart beamforming assumptions and rebuilt them to adapt in real time. Thresholds weren't numbers in manuals anymore. They bent with temperature, shipping noise, and adversary discipline. A watchstander could now tag a faint behavior, layer riding, coordinated depth shifts, edge of beam dancing, and the processor would adjust, checking 3 ways before letting it slide. False alarms went up at first. Training burned them down without dulling the edge. They added deception to the toolkit. Acoustic decoys that sounded like predictable targets were towed where it hurt adversaries to listen. Noise-shaping modules let our own boats blur their edges, not to vanish, but to push enemy processors into wrong bins. SURTASS and fixed arrays fused into a moving picture instead of a static map. A memo made the philosophy plain. Don't hide in silence. Hide in patterns the other side thinks it understands. Meanwhile, culture changed like a ship turning, slow then all at once. Access rotated harder. No one person held enough pages to build a map. Printers logged every click, and the logs were read by people who weren't afraid to ask why. Lifestyle anomalies, debt spikes, sudden cash, shiny stereos, tripped quiet interviews. The new rule wasn't paranoia, it was hygiene. Trust the ocean less. Validate everything, the memo said. It hung in vaults, not hallways. Doctrine shifted at sea. Forward presence stayed, but now it paired with deep ocean ambush. Instead of waiting at choke points the enemy could game, we set benign traps in water where they felt invulnerable. A US boat would drift quiet, battery cold, 100 miles from any line on a peacetime brief, and listen for the telltale breath that even disciplined hulls can't suppress forever. When it came, the skipper logged it and didn't celebrate. He let it pass, then moved the trap a little, never repeating the pattern that had just worked. SURTASS ships, the long, slow ocean listeners, filled gaps the fixed arrays couldn't cover. Their towed lines drew listening lanes wherever plans needed pressure. They were plodding and dull to crew, perfect to doctrine. Combined with fixed sensors, they created a shifting geometry the adversary couldn't pre-plan. One captain called it painting with ears. The phrase never made a slide. It made sense to people who'd lost the wall. Back at the labs, software updates stopped arriving as big bangs. They became quiet increments, pushed on odd days at odd hours, with feature flags that could be flipped if an adversary adapted. The enemy could no longer measure our pulse from the timing of our upgrades. That mattered as much as any decibel we gained. Training rewired the watch floors. New sailors still learned tonals and ladders, but their instructors drilled discomfort. Every few hours, exercise controllers injected a synthetic contact that violated a cherished rule by a hair, forcing a call that risked being wrong. The lesson was blunt. You're paid to decide, not admire clean grams. A petty officer who'd once taped a gram to the fridge now ran a module called Edges, where he told a room, write down what you want to be true. Now ignore it. Allies joined without fanfare. Sharing protocols tightened, but the circle widened to those who'd stand the watch. Iceland fed anomalies that Wales could test. Canada's arrays cross-checked Pacific behavior. The point wasn't friendship, it was geometry. More ears, more angles, more chances to catch a disciplined hull acting human at the worst possible moment. There were failures. An early decoy fooled us in an exercise, and for a week the word embarrassing sat in subject lines like a bruise. The fix wasn't to blame the decoy team, it was to harden the fusion, require 2 independent phenomena before a weapon quality call. It made us slower by seconds, safer by miles. A micro-story from a station that used to feel cursed. Midnight, a thin line, a behavior that felt like a hand brushing the wall. The watchstander called it out of family, got the shrug he expected, and then watched the new analyzer light a box. Pattern of life says this doesn't belong. He pushed it up. 2 days later, a patrol aircraft logged a passive cut closer than doctrine would have allowed a year before. The watchstander didn't get a medal. He got another shift and a coffee. That's how confidence returns, quietly, through work. In the end, the rebuild wasn't about louder ears. It was about smarter doubt. The quiet memo that closed the first phase said it without flourish. We will be surprised again. Build to bend. They did in silence because broadcasting resilience teaches an adversary where to lean. The last unanswered question hovered over every brief. How close did we get to disaster? No one answered out loud. They added another layer, then another. The last sleepless night. Inside the war room, the air felt refrigerated and stale, a place where nothing living should grow. A projector threw a red arc across the North Atlantic, simulated, but everyone leaned in like it could burn. The arc traced a Soviet launch track from water we hadn't seen, threading through a gap that used to be covered by confidence. The scenario wasn't hypothetical. It borrowed timings from the months our intercept curves sagged and glued them to a night we'd rather not name. The clock on the wall ticked soft, louder than breath. A commander stood by the screen, shoulders squared, voice low. He didn't talk about slides. He talked about a call he didn't make. One night deep in the window, he had a soft cue, thin, late, probably wrong. He could have launched a trail, pushed a crew into water crowded with risk. He didn't, he held. I told myself we were chasing ghosts, he said. If I was wrong, I bought them time. He swallowed, and the room felt smaller. He wasn't looking for absolution. He was leaving a mark on the record. Restraint can be a mistake too. The simulation advanced. A ballistic missile submarine, a dot in a sea of maybe, rode a layer edge we'd only recently learned to respect, then slid under a beam border, then paused as if listening to our breathing. A staffer clicked pause and wrote 3 times in the margin. We couldn't see him. Not a confession, a measurement. The model ran the first 2 minutes after a launch we didn't catch. Phones would ring, radios would light. The gap between detection and consequence shrank to a number that didn't let anyone sleep. Meanwhile, across town, a kitchen light snapped on at 3 a.m. A child padded in, hair stuck to a cheek, holding a question like a toy they didn't want to break. Where did Dad go? The spy's wife, eyes red from a night of not crying, said he had work. The child asked, all night. The clock said yes. The refrigerator hummed like a shipboard generator. The child drank water and stared at the back door, expecting it to open. It didn't. That silence, shared by 1,000 families during 1,000 deployments, now hid a different absence. The void answered with the same patience the ocean uses to wear down rock. Back in the war room, a declassified line slid onto the screen, stark, unadorned. We were lucky. Once. No context, no source, just a sentence that made everyone hear the second half without it being written. You can't buy luck wholesale. The commander who'd held his call rubbed his jaw and said, luck is not a tactic. Someone in the back repeated it under his breath, as if saying it twice could make it policy. The human cost showed up in places briefings don't account for. Crews pushed deeper into forward water, sleep debt measured in decisions instead of hours. Watchstanders started to see edges in their dreams, thin lines, almost tones, shapes riding layers like rails. Analysts blamed themselves for the false comfort of tidy models and wrote new ones with sharper teeth, then stared at ceilings counting the windows they'd trusted too long. Spouses learned the new cadence of extended patrols and quiet calls. The unit chaplain kept longer office hours and said fewer words. A micro-story. On a pier at dawn, an officer stood alone, hands in pockets, watching a crew line up to load groceries and jokes and a little bravado. He'd read the damage assessment, briefed the fixes, signed the rosters. He knew the layers and the beams and the new doctrine by heart. As the lines came off, he felt the dock tilt under the smallest farewell wave. He whispered to no one, "Be the wall," and then walked back to a building where walls were made of policy and paper and coffee. The lingering fear didn't come with sirens. It came with checklists. If one insider could blind a system built on physics and patience, what about the next? The fixes were strong, the layers smarter, the culture harder. But certainty had been demoted. Every threshold now had an asterisk. Every success carried a question. Did we see them because we're good or because they let us? The last screen in the war room went dark. The clock kept ticking. Outside, the ocean didn't change its mind. Inside, a handful of people decided to stay another hour, not because there was more to do, but because sleep felt like permission they hadn't earned yet. The secret they kept wasn't only about what was lost. It was about how close we'd come to learning the hard way what silence can hide. Legacy, what this changed, and what we still don't know. After the arrest, the ocean didn't snap back. The legacy settled in layers. The undersea game stopped pretending it was a map with lanes and timetables and turned into something messier, mysteries with moving answers. Planners stopped asking, "Where are they?" and started asking, "How will they behave if they know how we think?" That question rewired doctrine from the keel up. The US shifted investment from sheer listening to stealth itself. If the wall could bend, then the survivor would be the boat that made the least story in the water. Fast attack subs got quieter not just to hunt, but to vanish in places where fixed ears could be gamed. The boomers, the boats that carried the last word, moved into deeper patrol areas and changed their own rhythms so regularly that even allies only saw silhouettes, never habits. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Victor III era quieting forced that shift. Deterrence leaned away from omniscience and toward uncertainty you could live with. Allies noticed the wobble and asked harder questions. Intelligence sharing, once casual within trusted circles, tightened to controlled flows with auditable trails. Britain kept feeding the Atlantic picture, Canada strengthened the GIUK coverage, Iceland held its watch. But every transfer rode a new rule. Assume the other side might read over your shoulder. The club didn't shrink. It closed its doors and counted heads twice. Meanwhile, Soviet quieting accelerated. Some of it was real engineering, new propellers, better shaft mounts, clean power, discipline learned in dry docks. Some of it exploited gaps they'd been handed. The result for our side was the same. You hunted a foe that knew how your ears worked and trained its crews to skirt the edges. Knowable replaced noisy. The smugness of LOFAR mastery gave way to humility and fusion. Unknown to most, lessons bled into new domains. What the moles sold with paper, insiders now sell with credentials. Cyber operators study the same pattern, thresholds, maintenance windows, the pulse of a network instead of an ocean. A briefing for a different war used a line born of this one. Don't measure your defenses by your assumptions. The room understood. Old water, new wires, same blind side. You think domains change the rules just change the nouns. The audit reached into culture. Background checks added questions that felt personal because the failure had been personal. Debt, lies, rationalizations that lived in kitchens as much as vaults. Commands learned to read lifestyle data like grams, looking for burrs and pivots. It wasn't perfect, it was better. Commands that once prized the man who knew every routine now rotated him before routine turned into ownership. Some meanings were carved in quiet. A junior watchstander in Wales would tell new sailors, "You'll never know the contact you saved, only the one you missed." It wasn't poetry. It was how you endure when your victories are empty grams and safe mornings. A captain who'd lived the dark window took a desk and wrote doctrine that refused to teach the enemy habits. His office lights stayed on late. He left notes on margins. Bend here, never here. What we still don't know looms like weather off a coast. The classified boxes hold numbers that won't see daylight, which patrols slid by, how close a missile boat got to better water, whether discipline or luck kept an accident from birthing a catastrophe. Some Soviet archives opened for a season and then shut again. Former officers hinted at guidance that matched our worst suspicions, run under their math, time against their shifts, and then changed the subject. The truth is fractured across languages and loyalties, and some parts sank with ships. There's an open question with teeth. Did the leak shorten the Cold War by forcing us to innovate, or lengthen risk by handing our rival breathing room? The honest answer is both. Pain sharpened the work. Blindness raised the stakes. The ledger contains lives and budgets and nights spent staring at strip charts. No tally will feel fair. But wait, here's the twist. The real legacy is a habit of doubt that still pays off. The echoes keep traveling. A new generation of engineers, raised on anomaly detection and mistrust of neat curves, treat the ocean like a living adversary instead of a stage. Young officers learn that surprise is a feature of their career, not a glitch. And a handful of old hands, who remember the grams that went thin and the charts that lied politely, sit in the back of rooms and say little until the slide shows confidence unearned. Then they lean forward and ask the only question that matters: how do you know? The final legacy is a sentence pinned above quiet desks: trust, but instrument. The ocean invites belief, The adversary reads your habits. The system you rely on learns your taste and flatters it. The people who kept the watch learn to distrust praise from curves and comfort from patterns. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way to last. That betrayal sold time, and time is the currency of nuclear war. The minutes you don't see are the ones that decide if anyone wakes up tomorrow. The shield didn't fail with a blast. It thinned with habits exposed and pages fed through a copier. If you want the next untold breach that still shapes how we fight in silence, watch the video cued here. Subscribe if you want the stories whispered behind closed doors, the ones with fingerprints on binders and decisions that bent history. New episodes drop weekly. Take the next step before the trail goes cold.